Coming up on We Talk News this week, a historic day in D.C. Weed laws and rules are about to change as federal reform of cannabis takes a huge step forward in research. Reaction from the nation's capital to MJBizCon in Las Vegas. That's where Curaleaf CEO forecasts a big tobacco model for the future of the cannabis industry. And the Kentucky governor allows medical possession in his state and regulates Delta 8. All those stories and more on We Talk News with Elena Pinto. Next!
We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Weed Talk News. I'm Elena Pinto. We begin with historic news from the nation's capital this week. For the first time in U.S. history, a standalone piece of cannabis reform legislation is making its way to the president's desk for approval. This week, the Senate passed the Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act, which, as Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says, would eliminate the red tape hindering cannabis research for new treatments. The bill quickly passed the House earlier this year, and its fate in the Senate was uncertain, as most cannabis reform has been. But lo and behold, this huge move from the bipartisan chamber now puts the bill solely in the hands of President Biden to sign into law. Vote Pro podcast Phil Adams is in D.C. with a closer look at this historic news and more happening in the nation's capital.
Hi, I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro podcast, here with the Weed Talk News D.C. report. For the first time ever, a standalone cannabis reform bill has been sent to the president's desk. The Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act was approved by the Senate this week. The legislation is designed to encourage research into cannabis by streamlining the application process for researchers and removing many federal barriers. Advocates say the bill will make it easier to study the effects, risks, and benefits of cannabis and how cannabis-based medications can safely treat a variety of conditions. The measure was passed by the House of Representatives in July. Maryland lawmakers have set to work on legislation for implementing an adult-use cannabis market. With the legalization ballot initiative now passed by Maryland voters, the Cannabis Reform and Legalization Work Group convened this week to consider several key aspects of the future program, including commercial production, retail sales, and, of course, taxation. The work group is chaired by Delegate Luke Clippinger, who sponsored the ballot initiative as well as its companion implementation bill. With her party slated to take control of the House of Representatives in January, GOP Congresswoman Nancy Mace is urging colleagues from both parties to work together to end federal cannabis prohibition, saying that, quote, the only place that cannabis is controversial is in D.C. Mace expressed concern that if cannabis reform legislation doesn't pass during the current lame duck session, it may not happen for years. Last year, Mace introduced the States Reform Act, which would remove cannabis from Schedule I and provide a framework to allow states to make their own decisions regarding cannabis policy. That's the Weed Talk News DC report for this week. I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro Podcast.
Chuck Schumer says he's still hopeful more measures can be passed during the lame duck session, so we will keep you updated on that. Now, the midterm vote saw a handful of cannabis measures on ballots from the state down to the municipal level. And Missouri was one of two states to officially legalize cannabis for adult use. And it's looking like some of the sales could be starting sooner rather than later. Brandon Jones has the details in this week's Missouri report.
Hey everybody, it's Brandon Jones from Distribution Maven with the Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. And that's right, things are getting crazy here. Adult use was passed with the November 8 ballot, Amendment 3, a little bit over a 52% passing. And if you could get a little bit more closer look at the breakdown, it was the larger municipality areas like St. Louis, Kansas City that strongly were for the amendment to pass, and a lot of the rural areas outside of the larger cities were against. So it was a very tight race. It was up till 1:40 in the morning, hitting refresh on my thing to see when are the votes going to come in? Is it going to pass or not? It was kind of a nail biter, closer than we were hoping for, obviously, but it did pass. My story today comes out of the St. Louis Report, basically that they said by February 6th is when they would have all the licenses ready to go out and sales could be, ready to start. Now they're saying that they're going to expedite that process, since most of the license holders were already selling medicinal cannabis through their dispensaries, and they're the ones that got first access to the license. So they're thinking that very quickly, as soon as the facilities pass, inspection could actually start sales within a month or two. So not having to wait all the way until February 6th for each individual location, not going to be done by a state or by a county or by a district. Basically, as soon as that facility can pass the inspection, they are going to be able to start selling to all adult use people. Don't have to have your med card anymore. So things are getting a little crazy. And right here until February 8th, it's kind of a no law. There's no regulation. Basically, you do a $100 citation for smoking in public, or for having anything to do with cannabis is basically a $100 fine. So right now, until all the regulation is put in place, it's kind of a wild west right here. It's a fun time to be in Missouri, and really excited to get the adult use to get a lot more access to people here throughout the state. Again, I'm Brandon Jones from Distribution Maven with the Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Stay medicated and educated.
Kentucky was not one of the states to see any significant change when it comes to cannabis during the midterms, but that hasn't stopped Governor Andy Beshear from signing a pair of executive orders to give his constituents access to medical cannabis and protections for using it. The governor's orders will allow Kentuckians who meet qualifying conditions to purchase medical cannabis in states where sales are legal and use it back home in Kentucky. He also signed legislation regarding Delta-8 THC products because there are no real state or federal regulations in place for the substance right now. Beshear will allow state officials to set regulations on the packaging, sale, and purchase of Delta-8, which he hopes will set the state up for future success.
The structure can and will serve as a template for when the General Assembly fully legalizes medical cannabis. It means we can train our ABC officers. It means we can have the right regulations in place. And it means we can accelerate any timeline in the future when the General Assembly does the right and necessary thing to fully legalize medical cannabis. These are actions that I can take as governor to provide access to medical cannabis and relief to those who need it to better enjoy their life without pain.
Beshear goes on to acknowledge that some may not be satisfied with his actions given the limitations on executive orders, but he says it's a measured step Kentucky can take to help those struggling. This will all go into effect starting January 1st. There's some big legal news coming out of Oregon as well. A cannabis company in that state has filed a lawsuit to try and overturn a ban on import and export laws for the plant, claiming that the current law violates the U.S. Constitution's Dormant Commerce Clause. Marianne Kersagi has more from Oregon this week.
Marianne from Alibi Cannabis with this week's Oregon Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Some big news out of Oregon this week. Greenlight Law Group has filed a lawsuit seeking a declaration that Oregon's cannabis export laws are unconstitutional. This could be a huge first step for interstate commerce. Interstate commerce would be a life-saving measure for the cannabis industry in Oregon. And Leafly published the top 12 strains for November. 2 are out of Oregon: Hawaii Skunk Face by Loud and the delightful Blue Truffle from Alibi. The advice from Leafly is to get fancy with the bubbler full of the Blue Truffle and a new season of The Crown. That'll do it for the Oregon Report this week. I'm off to binge watch The Crown now. I'm Marianne with Alibi for Weed Talk News.
In happier business news, this week is MJBizCon in Las Vegas. And many of the industry's movers and shakers are there to cover what's happening in the business of cannabis, including several members of the Weed Talk News team. The gathering is touted as the largest cannabis business event in the world, and it never seems to disappoint. But strangely enough, one of the biggest talking points coming out of this week's panels is related to tobacco. Curaleaf Executive Chairman Boris Jordan spoke during an investor forum where he predicted that the cannabis industry will likely emulate a model that the tobacco industry has been following. Jordan referenced a close friend of his in the tobacco industry, saying, they've talked about how the country's cannabis industry needs overlap in supply chain to bring down the price of products. Jordan believes that likely would lead to a similar supply chain model as tobacco, with only a few companies dominating the global market. He went on to say the biggest tobacco companies are so dominant because they share resources and only differentiate on brands, which is also a trend we've started to see in cannabis. Of course, a better price for the consumer is always good to see, but is it worth the cost of cutting craft cultivators and mom and pop companies out of the mix? Only time and the industry will tell. Well, let's check in now with our international correspondents to see what's happening outside the US this week.
Hello, I'm Lex Pelger from White Whale Creations with this week's European Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Germany's Federal Social Court ruled that health insurance companies only need to cover medical cannabis for the most seriously ill patients. Already, patients must try every other medication before being allowed to use medical cannabis, and with this ruling, it will make it even harder for patients to afford their medicine. With legalization coming soon in Germany, there are fears that patients will be left behind. In related news, the government of the Czech Republic announced it is coordinating with Germany on their own adult use cannabis laws. Long a leader in the space, Czech has had decriminalized possession since 2010, medical cannabis since 2013, and is one of the only nations in the EU to allow up to 1% THC in their hemp. Now, as they move forward with legal cannabis, they want to coordinate with their large neighbor to the north. Finally, bad news in Ireland. The High Court dismissed a lawsuit that challenged the country's ban on the sale of products containing any amount of THC. The judge said that as a signatory to the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, the seized hemp oil products at the center of this lawsuit could not be sold even if they were produced elsewhere in the European Union legally. With this ruling, the Emerald Isle holds its place as one of the most anti-cannabis countries in the EU. That's the European Cannabis Report for this week. For more on the science side, see my newsletter on Substack, Cannabinoids and the People. I'm Lex Pelger from White Whale Creations, reporting for Weed Talk News.
Hi, this is Debbie Facey from Weed Talk News, your Canadian correspondent with your Canadian Weekly Joint. This week in Canada, we have a survey which George Smitherman has asked most of the Canadian industry leaders as well as consumers and thought leaders to put in their input when it comes to the bill that we have as of right now when it comes to the cannabis industry. So far over the last 4 years, we have been going through a hurdle of different comment, but yet not enough data to be able to justify many of the comments demands that a lot of the consumers are asking for. Also, at the same time, many of the brands and LPs are also suffering due to the lack of money that is coming into their pockets, as well as being able to turn over it properly for the cannabis industry here in Canada to be able to have that turnover be successful. So what George Smitherman has asked is for us to address 5 of the main problems that we do find that is happening in this sector, which is injustice within minorities. We also have the making sure that the education and knowledge is being provided to the consumers, ensuring that the medical patients are also having fair access, not having any of our packaging as well as our product get in the hands of the youth, and as well as making the market overall just something that is affordable for not only the consumers but for the stores that actually are dispensaries here in Canada. So what I've noticed, especially when it came to our surveys, was that there was a lot of things that we needed to address. And especially when it came to our illegal and elite market. A lot of times what happens, especially here, is that we find that we don't want to educate or provide the knowledge that is needed for both markets to be successful. And successful as in being weaned out and becoming the more prone of choice. And I feel that's something that is a definite factor that Canada does lack due to the fact that our branding and marketing is not as lax as the States, doesn't allow the amount of knowledge, and doesn't allow the amount of, I don't want to say freedom of speech, but freedom of speech when it does come to the education behind what we do know about cannabis as a whole. When it comes to the injustice and the fairness when it comes to minorities, that's something that unfortunately Canada did mess up in the beginning. And I don't want to be rude about that, but being obviously a visible minority myself and being within the industry for the last 10 years, they decided to bypass many of the people that they knew were part of, sorry, I should say in camera, knew that were part of the culture, but may not necessarily, I want to say, demonstrate the culture appropriately. And we could obviously see that as a whole, and I don't need to go into depth with that, but that is something where Canada needs to take the accountability for and understand that it was never a race, it was more based on the culture and the education of where cannabis actually came from and the strains that we're actually producing. So if we actually knew the history, like most of us do that are very enthused with the cannabis, we know that it's been grown worldwide. So race would never have been a factor if we just actually took more into places and the knowledge and the culture behind it. And when it comes to our packaging is something that is not fancy. It's very ugly. It's very, I almost want to say bland and almost very scary because it's not enticing. But at the same time, we're having the issue where the packaging is being literally thrown throughout the cities. You could find it everywhere. Not only the packaging, the wrappers, that leads to pets, animals getting into it, the now unexplained rates that are number of percentages of rates that we have of animals going into the hospital, as well as the young that are getting into it. And that is due to the fact that some of the packaging is unreasonable. And that's also coming from someone that has a disability. There's too much packaging and there's too much waste, where I could do see some of the incidents where some of the actual product could just be left on the side because it's easier access for the actual person that needs it to be able to actually obtain it and use it, compared to the fact of them lacking the accountability of just not taking the right of putting it away from a young or from an animal. Also, the last thing that I have to say, especially when it comes to the education, was we are not going to be able to necessarily fix the education without going back into history and understanding that we have to bring in the individuals that understand what cannabis is, know what cannabis is, but want to also continue to teach cannabis to others. And that's not just due to the fact that they just have a job in cannabis now or the fact that they've loved weed. It's more to that. And it's the same thing as an example as the shirts or the outfits that you're wearing today. We wouldn't be able to have any of these outfits if we didn't have any of the farmers that were growing any of the fibers, and we had any of the manufacturers then creating the actual material, and the fashion designers that are actually creating the designs that are then created into displays by the merchandisers, then which are bought by us. So if we don't really understand the process of something, how are we going to be able to state the fact that the education isn't there, or we're lacking the education and knowledge, when there's more than enough people within Canada, within the world, just as a whole, that know more that want to give and provide, and at the same time have the knowledge to be able to back it up. So when it comes to Canada and our laws and what we need to do and what we need to reformat, we need to start paying attention to what actually needs to be said and what actually needs to be heard, which is medical needs to be forefront. We need to make sure that the knowledge and the education is being taught to both the recreational and the medicinal. We need to make sure our packaging makes sense and we're not contributing to global warming and the amount of waste. And we need to make sure that we are taking accountability when it comes to the injustice of minorities not being in a space due to the lack of confidence in oneself. So this is Debbie Facey, your Canadian correspondent for We Talk News, with your Canadian Weekly Joint.
The battle to make the budding cannabis industry more inclusive continues. And in Washington state, there's a big sign of success. Regulators there have officially established social equity support for the state. And Josh Kincaid has the details in this week's Washington State Report.
Washington establishes a social equity support program. The state's new Social Equity in Cannabis Task Force and the Social Equity in Cannabis Technical Assistance Program were created to reduce barriers to entry in the cannabis industry for individuals and communities most impacted by the war on drugs. The task force will allow approximately 40 additional cannabis retail licenses to be issued for social equity purposes, according to a release. Those licenses are going to replace the approximate 40 licenses that were canceled, forfeited, revoked, or never issued in specific jurisdictions across Washington. Separately, the Washington Department of Commerce partnered with the State Liquor and Cannabis Board, the LCB, and they made Green Go. That's a cannabis business development consulting company to create a social equity and cannabis technology or technical assistance program. So that program includes one-on-one mentoring for social applicants seeking retail licenses, as well as online learning modules to help educate operators on a range of business development topics such as accounting, finance, market research, strategies, and more. Next week, you guys are going to find out more about the Washington State cannabis scene. But with that, we're going to have to roll up this Washington State Cannabis Report. I'm Josh Kincaid from the Talking Heads reporting for We Talk News. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out.
That's not the only state looking to improve on its social equity efforts. Loan money is officially about to start rolling out for applicants in Illinois. Thomas Howard takes a closer look there.
Hey, everybody, it's me, cannabis industry lawyer Tom Howard with Weed Talk News, here to update you on what's going on in the state of Illinois in its cannabis industry. First, there has been an announcement regarding the constitutionality of the veteran points that have been hotly disputed. In the case that deals with the dispensaries and not the craft grows, they found there was a rational basis and the veteran points are constitutional, but they couched their opinion and said that only applies in this case, and so it may not apply in the craft grower case. However, it might. The craft grower case is slowly grinding along. There will be resolutions on it coming in January, and then the merits of the claims, at least when it comes to the legal issues, shall start getting answered in early spring. Also, the first loan for a social equity applicant who won a craft grow Helios Labs and Ambrose Jackson's teams at 1937 Group was finally awarded the first social equity loan so that they can capitalize their business and get open for operations, which is a great thing. More dispensaries will be opening soon. The state sent out a press release on November 10th that said the first dispensary, I think it was called Ivy Rose, and there was actually another one in the Chicagoland area, has opened for business. So the first new licensed dispensaries are also open. That means that there's at least one craft grow, one infuser, and 2 new dispensaries open in the state of Illinois. Once again, that's why I do not advocate for the limited license state. Back to you, Elena, with everybody at Weed Talk News.
Traveling east, reform to cannabis on the federal level could bring a wave of changes to several states as well. Lawmakers in Massachusetts are not only calling for social equity efforts to be included, but state regulators are weighing in on what federal legalization could mean for them. We Talk News producer Tori Chamberlain has this week's Bay State Report.
Hey guys, I'm Tori Chamberlain, and here's what's happening in the Bay State this week. While the conversation around social equity efforts continues to take center stage, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from right here in Massachusetts is pushing for more of those efforts to be placed on the federal agenda. Here's what she had to say on the heels of a bipartisan hearing for cannabis reform earlier this week.
With marijuana arrests accounting for nearly half of all drug arrests, today's hearing really does underscore the need to combat this crisis by legalizing marijuana and repairing the harm of incarceration by providing pathways into the legal cannabis industry for those directly impacted. As the cannabis industry is projected to raise revenues of over $50 billion, that's with a B, dollars by 2026, a recent report found that less than 2% of the industry is owned and operated by Black entrepreneurs. This is certainly a grave injustice.
And while we're waiting to see what federal reform could happen on Capitol Hill during the lame duck session, Massachusetts regulators are also starting to weigh in on what that could mean for them. Citing an article here from Commonwealth Magazine, Cannabis Control Commission Executive Director Sean Collins recently discussed some potential pitfalls from federal regulation that could ultimately disrupt the market here in Massachusetts. The state has some pretty rigid laws when it comes to cultivation and using pesticides and things like that. And if federal legalization were to happen, some of those regulations could definitely change that wouldn't be in line with what state regulators currently have. So they're curious about what kind of problems this could bring up. The commission also pointed to concerns that interstate commerce could stir up for Massachusetts because we have such a strict seed to sale tracking system. So we'll have to keep an eye on how all of that could shake out if and when we see any sort of federal reform. But the industry is still blooming here in the Bay State. This past weekend, the 6th annual Harvest Cup competition was held at the DCU Center in Worcester. Judges from all parts of the industry ranked 16 different categories of concentrates, flower, CBD oil, topicals, and edibles. Saturday and Sunday were both packed with thousands of cannabis lovers and businesses. One of the favorites every year is Northeast Alternatives out of Fall River, Massachusetts. Brand ambassador Francesca Chur, aka the Dab Cowgirl on Instagram, should have won an award for the best costume. PCM founder and In the Weeds host Jimmy Young talked with her about the dominance of her dispensary at the Harvest Cup.
And I'm here with the brand ambassador from Northeast Alternatives. And her name, I'm just going to call her Francesca, okay, because I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce her last name. But Francesca, you guys won not just one category, a whole bunch.
Yeah, we won a whole bunch. We actually won in the categories for the topicals. We won in categories for the sauces, for the edibles, and we just won for CBD flower for runner-up and for the main winner today. So I'm really excited about that as a CBD fan myself.
What is the secret sauce that Northeast Alternatives obviously has? Because it's not just this year that you guys won. I've been here a couple of times. You guys are fairly regular in the winners circle.
It's the care and the people and the values. We actually just started a new brand called Valorum, which is values in Latin. We started that brand so that we could give back 1% of our profits from that to the Social Equity Fund in Massachusetts. Because we're not just trying to lift up our own team, we're trying to lift up everyone, including those people who were disproportionately affected by the war on drugs.
That is absolutely a beautiful thing. I call that socially responsible capitalism.
Yes, we're trying to make sure that we're bringing up everyone in this community, not just the people in our company. We are going really strong. I think we have 300 or 400 people that work with us, and I think the reason why we keep winning is because everyone from top to bottom cares. It's the amount of care that we put not just into our product, but into the way that we treat each other, the way that we go out into the world, and the care for this community. That's what's at the bottom line of everything we're doing, and that's why we're winning.
And that's what's happening in the Bay State this week. I'm Tori Chamberlain.
The numbers are in for Michigan, and sales reports show retailers sold more than $200 million worth of weed just last month. But it's not all sunshine and dollar signs. This week, the state's cannabis regulatory agency also begun its crackdown on illicitly grown cannabis entering the regulated market, suspending both the medical and recreational licenses for, quote, green culture in Flint for selling unregulated joints. Here's Michigan Normal Executive Director Rick Thompson with more.
Hello again, everyone. This is the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson on Weed Talk News. Let's begin. Big news from the CRA this week as the department issued a notice of suspension on the license of Green Culture, a med and adult use retailer in Flint, for possessing unregulated cannabis at their establishment. Now, here's how the story goes according to the CRA narrative. Back in 2019 and 2020, when it was legal to purchase and sell medical marijuana from caregivers in our adult use retail stores, someone bought up a whole boatload of buds and has had them ever since. Green Culture purchased massive quantities of cannabis from a licensed hemp processor called Be Pure Health, also known as ACF Labs, in a scheme to wash the cannabis of any metric traces. See, when you purchase smokable hemp products, there is no metric tag because it's hemp. There isn't product testing because it's hemp. And you don't need to use a secure transporter because it's hemp, unless it isn't hemp, which happens to be the case here. Be Pure Health can claim they harvested this as hemp and just package up the old caregiver cannabis in new pre-rolls and hand them out to anybody for free or charge them for it. Green Culture gave out 18,000 packages of these products in a period of time starting February 10 and going until September 30 of this year. The products were labeled Moon Rock Blunts, which is a name I think we can all agree would never be assigned to a truly hemp product. Now, how do we know this is the history of that cannabis? First, the CRA tested 51 samples of this forbidden fruit, and only 2 of them tested below the 0.3% THC level, which define hemp products. Second, the CRA supposedly has statements from people working at Green Culture that corroborate the timeline and the details they laid out. Bottom line here, Green Culture's license to operate has been suspended. There is a product alert, not a recall, for the thousands of individual products sold in 2022. And Interim Director Brian Hanna said this in yesterday's published notice: "It is my intention to pursue revocation of these licenses. Other marijuana licensees should take note. We will not stop investigating until we clear the regulated market of this type of activity," end the quote. Well, that should make 2023 a very interesting year for Michigan's regulated cannabis industry. Superstar independent journalist Eric Van Dusen has published the results of his Freedom of Information Act inquiry into the abhorrent malfeasance of the Michigan State Police in regards to their false positive lab results where CBD in a bloodstream was reported to prosecutors as THC. Now, they discovered their error as a piece of sheer luck, nothing more. A prosecutor questioned lab results for a very elderly woman who had her blood taken after an automobile crash. The toxicology results showed a very high percentage of THC in her blood, and the prosecutor knew that was incorrect and asked if her heart medication might have caused the abnormal results since she had not had any cannabis. The lab made some inquiries. Someone from Macomb County shared with the lab a scientific paper which outlined the conversion of CBD into THC as a result of out-of-date lab practices using acidic reagents. The lab initiated their own tests, confirmed their error, and then stopped testing for THC on their own and shuttled all required test samples to an outside testing agency. Now, turns out this is a truly horrible scenario. Of the 700 samples they sent out, they received confirmation test results for 238 blood kits, which had already been tested by the State Police Crime Lab using their old methods. Now, 2 of those MSP positive tests were found to be false positives. Now, that averages out to about 6 false positives for the 700 samples, which represents just 1/4 of the 2022 yearly sampling. Math indicates the Michigan State Police delivered grossly incorrect lab results in about 25 tests each year. Outrageous. Consumers who maintained they had only had CBD gummies or liquid were improperly charged and prosecuted. The State Police Crime Lab resumed testing for THC as of November 9. One can only hope there's a pathway to recourse for those many, many people whose criminal prosecutions and plea arrangements were predicated on a false narrative spun by police and prosecutors. And that's it for the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson for Weed Talk News.
And hold on to your hats, New Yorkers, because legal weed may be ready for purchase sooner than you think. NBC New York reports state regulators are ready to hand out the first retail dispensary licenses on Monday, with 150 licenses ready to issue over the next week. 70 in New York City alone. And some of those shops could be ready to let customers in the door before 2022 is over. After all, it's a whole new world of weed out there, so remember to use it wisely. I'm Elena Pinto for Pro Cannabis Media, and we are taking a Thanksgiving break next week, and so should you. We'll see you to start off the month of December.
Which at first I thought, oh, I don't know if I'm an activist, but I have, held a bullhorn on the State House steps. I have frequently testified before the Cannabis Control Commission in the state legislature, and I'm not, shy about criticizing where I see, mistakes being made. So yeah, I think that's what differentiates me, just an appreciation for the plant. And then also I'm a cannabis entrepreneur myself. I've started businesses, so I've lived that entrepreneurial journey. I know how hard it is. It is absolutely a marathon, not a sprint. So I think that, I'm in the game, not just on the sidelines.
As a broker, we have access to many, many cannabis carriers. So I will go in with 2 or 3 quotes for people. The quotes might be $20,000 for one, $22,000 for another, $17,500 for another. Pretty close among the 3. What I tell people is it's not the pricing, it's what's included and not included, meaning exclusions. An exclusion in layman's terms is just something that's not included. It's not on the menu, so it's just not included. But if you don't know that, if no one shows you that on page 71 of a 150-page policy, you're not going to know. No one knows. I never met one person that says they read an insurance policy. If you do, I got some property in Florida for you.
Weed Talk and In the Weeds are 2 productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
So the reality of the matter is, big banks and small banks are going to be different in a lot of ways. And they're both going to have their advantages and disadvantages. For a business like cannabis, you really have to have an integral knowledge of that business and a real granular knowledge of that business and the players involved in it. And that's why if you look at the banks that are successful to play in this space in Massachusetts, they are smaller banks that are very heavy, intensified personal touch, human communication, where you don't get a lot of that with the bigger banks.
Bay State Cannabis Report is supported by Holyoke Cannabis, Holyoke's finest cannabis recreational experience.